A huge number of French companies are ingrained in all of our economies around the world with their borrowings and so on and so forth. It is crucial for the Eurozone. And the United States could possibly impose 10% plus tariffs on goods coming from places like France and also Germany, just as these two crucial members of the EU are also politically on the brink as well.
Once again, the French government is teetering on the verge of a collapse. The Prime Minister, Michel Barnier, is at risk of a no-confidence motion as he presents his social security financing plan. Nina dos Santos is the former Europe editor of CNN and joins us now. Nina, make a little bit of sense of this for us, if you can. Talk us through what has triggered the no-confidence motion.
Well, what we've seen in the last half hour or so is Michel Barnier stand up in the Assemblée Nationale, that is the French Parliament, and start to deliver this social security part of the budget that France, the second biggest economy inside the EU, desperately needs to pass with a government that's been nominated from one of the most unpopular parts of the political spectrum. Michel Barnier himself is a conservative. He's not an ideal candidate, but he's the person who, after Emmanuel Macron announced that snap election over the summer, split the vote in three different ways among three different parties. Barnier, he thought, was the one who was the most likely in terms of being an experienced and palatable enough politician to the far right, Marine Le Pen's party, that he could probably stand the best chance of trying to get any legislation through. And the biggie, of course, is the budget, which is what's going through the French Parliament this week. Now, Michel Barnier has two options for trying to get this law through. And this is one of the reasons why financial markets are on tenterhooks at the moment, looking at what's happening in France. He could either put it to a vote, which he might lose. He might scrape it through if the far right National Rally Party abstain, but if they vote against it, well, he could be torpedoed. Otherwise, he could use a constitutional maneuver to avoid putting it through a vote because he doesn't have the numbers, but that could leave him exposed to a no confidence vote, which could happen on Wednesday. So the stakes are extremely high. We're likely to see which way he's going to go this afternoon.
And in practical terms, Nina, what actually happens to a government if it collapses? You know, we say this as a term, as if everybody understands what comes next, but what does it mean?
Well, for France, it's a really complicated situation. There's so much riding on it, largely because France can't have another set of legislative or parliamentary elections for another 6 months. You can only have one per year. And the last one was held prematurely by Emmanuel Macron in the summer. So the real calculation Marine Le Pen's party is trying to make here, because remember, Michel Barnier is from the, as I said before, least popular party, the Les Républicains. These are the really famous Conservative Party of France, but it's been torpedoed over the last few years in terms of its support. He governs with the sort of tacit approval of the far right, but she has to make the political calculation of whether or not she would be blamed if France's economy goes south and the country gets gripped in a state of stasis, if the bond markets run wild, and she would be penalized. On the other hand, the other thing she has to think about is her political future, because what she really wants to do is go for the French presidency the next time it's up in 2 years' time in 2027. And the problem is she's facing some legal travails of her own that could knock her out of that race. Those legal travails could start to bubble back up in the next month or two. So she's trying to figure out whether now is the moment to try and not just torpedo Michel Barnier's government, but also try and push for Emmanuel Macron to resign. Technically, he doesn't have to do that, but French public opinion is really going against him. There was a poll just the other day that estimated that half of French voters actually think that it's time for Macron to go.
There is never a good time for a government to collapse, but if we look at what France actually does on the world stage, this is a particularly crucial time, isn't it? I mean, we shouldn't neglect the fact that it played its part in the ceasefire in Lebanon. Obviously, its strength is relevant to Ukraine. I mean, these really are very crucial times, aren't they?
Absolutely. And Emmanuel Macron has been one of those figures who's been very loud on the international stage, talking about how Europe and NATO needs a far more strategic vision if the United States, when Donald Trump comes back into office the start of next year, starts to sort of disassociate itself from being the security guarantor of this part of the world, particularly with regards to Germany, which is the other big political and economic decision maker across the EU. With France in possibly political chaos here, we already know that its economy is in a far worse shape than some other smaller Eurozone countries. If both Germany and France find themselves facing economic spirals as well as political problems, because Germany's heading to the polls next year too, that could be a real nightmare for trying to sort out problems like the war in Ukraine, when Donald Trump has made it very clear that he would like to see Ukraine possibly capitulate on some of its terms if there were to be a peace deal. And as you said before, France has a huge role to play in places like Lebanon because of its history and its long-standing cultural ties there. So what's happening in France really matters geopolitically. It also matters economically as well, because if you look at the economics of France, its deficit is already at 6.1% of GDP. That is more than double the EU's own top limits for deficits for other crucial countries. It's got a huge bond market, a huge number of French companies are ingrained in all of our economies around the world with their borrowings and so on and so forth. It is crucial for the Eurozone. And the United States could possibly impose 10% plus tariffs on goods coming from places like France and also Germany, just as these two crucial members of the EU are also politically on the brink as well. So it's partly geopolitical, this issue, but it's also very much economic as well. And that's why some say we could be seeing the start of potentially another Eurozone crisis 2.0, like 15 years ago.
And for the average French person, sorry to apply the adjective average to anybody really, but does it mean the same thing that a financial crash has meant in this country, that suddenly all of your household borrowing goes up, a mortgage becomes incredibly difficult to get? It's that kind of hardship and penury.
Well, mortgages are quite different across the Eurozone, particularly in places like France, where people don't necessarily re-leverage and keep the outstanding debt and re-leverage every 2, 3, 5 years. Over there, they're much, much longer mortgages and people have the obligation to pay them down. So slightly different in terms of that. Also, the home ownership rates are a bit different across the Eurozone. But the point really is just that, there are huge French banks. This is a huge part of the Eurozone. Indeed, the person at the helm of the European Central Bank, Madame Christine Lagarde, is a French politician. And she used to be the head of the IMF before, at the time when countries like America, France, also Germany, were having to dole out very hard economic medicine to other weaker Eurozone members like Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and Spain, and so on and so forth. So it is, some in the EU might say, a moment of reckoning for France, because it's always been an embarrassment, frankly, that France has been allowed to get away with such high structural spending and deficits. For your average French person, though, just going back to your question and to answer it properly, it would be a big shock, because the reality is that, and I know, having been brought up myself in French, as a lot of time in the country, there are higher expectations for when it comes to the amount of state support your average citizen expects in terms of benefits, entitlements, the medical system, and so on and so forth. So France really can't afford to get this wrong, which is why Michel Barnier says he needs to try and push through what is essentially an austerity budget, including about 60 billion euros worth of tax hikes and also some severe spending cuts. That is what has irked both Marine Le Pen on the right, but also the other third of the vote on the left, on the far left, who also say, look, now is not the moment. People are coping with the cost of living crisis. Why should they have to swallow austerity at a moment like this?
Nina, thank you very much. Nina dos Santos is the former Europe editor of CNN.